Amaterasu and Susanoo explained. The sibling rivalry that nearly ended the world. In the silent, unending tapestry of mythology, there are threads of creation and destruction, of love and of betrayal. Few threads, however, are woven with such vibrant and volatile color as the saga of the Japanese gods. It is a story that begins not with a bang, but with a breath, a tear, and a cry of defiance. This is not merely a tale of gods and monsters, but a cosmic family drama of such earth-shattering intensity that it threatened to extinguish the very light of creation. It is the story of two siblings. One, the radiant heart of order and light. The other, the tempestuous soul of chaos and the storm. Welcome, seekers of lore, to the Eldritch Codex. Today we unravel the sacred chronicles of the Shinto faith to bring you the story of Amaterasu Amikami, the great goddess of the sun, and her turbulent brother, Susanoo no Mikoto, the god of storms. This is the tale of a sibling rivalry that broke the heavens, plunged the world into darkness, and was only resolved through an act of heroic, monstrous sacrifice. This is the story of how the world was almost lost, and how it was saved. In the beginning there was no beginning. There was no time, no form, no sound. Only the Takama no Hara, the high plane of heaven, a silent, formless potential. Below it lay an endless, viscous sea of brine and chaos, a primordial soup from which all things would eventually rise. From this great stillness, the first sparks of divinity emerged, spontaneous and ethereal. These were the Koto Amatsukami, gods born alone, who shaped the fundamental order of the cosmos before concealing their forms from existence. Generations of deities followed, each pair bringing the universe closer to a state of tangible reality. And then, from this divine lineage, the seventh and final generation appeared. They were the architects of the mortal world, the two deities whose love and sorrow would set the stage for all that was to come. He was Izanagi no Mikoto, he who invites. And she, his younger sister and wife, was Izanami no Mikoto, she who invites. Together they stood upon the floating bridge of heaven, gazing down not at a world, but at a possibility. The chaos below churned like a thick, oily sea. Izanagi held in his hand the Aim no Nuboko, a heavenly spear, encrusted with celestial jewels. He lowered its tip into the abyss. They stirred the formless void, the divine spear creating a great whirlpool in the churning mass. When they were satisfied, they lifted the spear high. From its jeweled point, drops of the heavy chaotic brine fell back into the sea below. But these drops did not dissolve. They coagulated, thickened, and hardened, rising up from the waters to become the first solid land. They called this island Onagorishamath, self-forming island. It was to be their home and the foundation of a new world. Descending from the heavens, they erected a great celestial pillar upon this new earth and built a palace around it. It was here they would undertake their sacred duty, to give birth to the land and the gods who would inhabit it. They devised a marriage ritual, a celestial dance around the great pillar. Izanagi would circle it from the left, and Izanami from the right. When they met, they would speak words of praise and unite. But in their first attempt, a critical error was made. Upon meeting, it was Izanami, the woman, who spoke first. "Ah, what a fair and lovely youth!" she exclaimed. Izanagi replied in kind, but felt a sense of unease. "Ah, what a fair and lovely maiden!" Their union from this exchange produced a flawed child, Hiriko, the leech child, born boneless and weak. Distraught, they set it adrift in a boat of reeds and consulted the elder gods in heaven. The divinities confirmed their fears. The ritual had been performed incorrectly. The male deity must always be the first to speak. Learning from their mistake, they performed the ritual anew. This time, upon meeting, it was Izanagi who spoke first. "Ah, what a fair and lovely maiden! Ah, what a fair and lovely youth!" Izanami replied. This time the ritual was correct. The order was proper. And their union was blessed. From their sacred marriage, The islands of the Japanese archipelago were born one by one. The great island of Honshu, the rugged isle of Kyushu, the verdant land of Shikoku. Each island was a deity in itself, a living child of the creator gods. After creating the land, they began to populate it with its spirits, giving birth to the kami of the mountains, the rivers, the wind, and the trees. Creation was in full bloom. A divine family was bringing a vibrant world into being. But creation is a perilous act. The joy of birth is always shadowed by the reality of death. Their sacred work came to a horrific and abrupt end with the birth of their final child. This child was Kagutsuchi, the incarnation of fire. His birth was a cataclysm. As he came into the world, his very being, a living inferno, scorched and consumed his mother from within. Izanami, the great mother goddess who had given birth to the land itself, cried out in agony and collapsed, fatally burned. Her divine spirit, now marked by the passage of death, began its descent into Yomi no Kuni, the land of the Dhyata subterranean realm of perpetual gloom. Izanagi's heart was shattered. In a fit of grief and rage, he drew his 10-span sword and struck down his newborn son, the fire god Kagutsuchi, whose birth had cost him everything. From Kagutsuchi's blood and body, still more gods were born, but this brought no comfort to the grieving Izanagi. His love for Izanami was all-consuming. He could not accept her fate. He resolved to do the impossible, to journey into the underworld itself and bring her back. He traveled to the shadowy entrance of Yomi, a place of dread and decay. He called out her name, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence. From the darkness beyond the gate, her voice answered, filled with sadness. She told him he was too late. She had already eaten from the hearth of the underworld, partaken of its food. To do so was to be eternally bound to Yomi. She could never return. I will not accept it, Izanagi pleaded. He begged her to come back with him, to finish their work of creation. Moved by his love, she relented slightly. She would try. She would go and speak to the gods of Yomi to ask for her release. But she made him swear a solemn oath. You must not look at me, she warned. Promise me, my beloved, that you will not try to see me until I return. Izanagi promised. He waited for what felt like an eternity in the suffocating darkness. The silence stretched on, and a terrible impatience began to gnaw at him. Why was she taking so long? Had she abandoned him? Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, he betrayed his oath. He took a tooth from the sacred comb he wore in his hair, and setting it alight, he created a small torch. The light pierced the gloom and he saw her. But it was not the radiant, beautiful goddess he loved. Before him stood a rotting, maggot-eaten corpse, a thing of utter horror and decay from which monstrous thunder deities were being born. Izanami, the mother of the world, was now a vessel of putrefaction. A scream of terror escaped Izanagi's lips. He turned and fled. From the darkness behind him came a shriek of pure rage. It was the voice of Izanami, shamed and furious at his betrayal. You have shamed me, she screamed. She dispatched the foul hags of the underworld to capture him. As they closed in, Izanagi threw his headdress, which magically transformed into a cluster of wild grapes, distracting them. When they pursued again, he threw his comb, which sprouted into a grove of bamboo shoots. But Izanami herself, now a monstrous figure of rage, led the chase along with the legions of Yomi. In a final desperate act, Izanagi reached the border of the worlds and found 3 peaches growing on a tree of fruit with powerful purifying magic. He hurled them at his pursuers and they retreated. He did not hesitate. He found a boulder so massive it would take 1,000 men to move, and with the last of his divine strength, he rolled it into place, sealing the passage between the land of the living and the land of the dead forever. From behind the stone, Izanami's voice cried out, thick with a curse. My beloved lord, she seethed. Because you have done this, I will strangle to death 1,000 of the people in your land each day. Izanagi, his heart now cold with the finality of their separation, replied, My beloved, if you do that, then I shall ensure that 1,500 birthing huts are built each day. And so, the eternal cycle of death and birth was established. The final, terrible divorce between life and death was complete. Izanagi had survived, but he was no longer pure. He was tainted by the filth and pollution that Kegurove the underworld. He sought a place of cleansing, a river in the land of Hyuga, to perform the sacred ritual of Mythology full-body purification in running water. As he washed himself, shedding the last remnants of his journey to the land of death, a final magnificent miracle occurred. From his discarded clothes and the grime of his body, other gods were born. But the most important came last, born from the purification of his face. As he washed his left eye, a goddess of unparalleled splendor and radiance burst forth into existence. She was pure light, the promise of the dawn. He named her Amaterasu Amikami, the great august divinity who shines in heaven. As he washed his right eye, another deity emerged, this one of serene, cool, and tranquil beauty. He was the pale light of the evening. He named him Tsukumi no Mikoto, the god of the moon and the night. And finally, as he washed his nose, a third child was born, not with light but with sound and fury. He came forth with the force of a thunderclap and the roar of a great gale. He was Takaya Susanoo no Mikoto, the brave, swift, impetuous male, the god of the seas and storms. Izanagi rejoiced. These were his finest children, the Mihashira no Yuzunomiko, the three precious children, born not from union but from purification. His great work was finally done. He bestowed upon them their kingdoms. To his most brilliant child Amaterasu, he gave his sacred bead necklace and declared her the ruler of the high plane of heaven, the source of all light, order, and cosmic harmony. To Tsukuyomi, he granted dominion over the realm of the night. And to his powerful volatile son Susanoo, he gave mastery over the great and boundless oceans. The cosmos had its rulers. The divine stage was set. Heaven, night, and the sea were all under new command. But in the heart of the youngest, the god of storms, a deep and inconsolable grief was already taking root. A grief that would soon curdle into a rage that would challenge the heavens, threaten his luminous sister, and plunge the newly formed world into an age of absolute darkness. The cosmos had found its new order. In the celestial realm, Amaterasu assumed her throne with the grace befitting the sun itself. Her reign brought structure, light, and harmony to the heavens. Her brother, Tsukuyomi, accepted his dominion over the night, providing a calm and silent counterpart to her radiant day. The universe was in a state of delicate, divine equilibrium. But one pillar of this new order was unstable. One of the three precious children refused his sacred mandate. Susanoo no Mikoto, to whom the vast and mighty expanse of the sea had been entrusted, did not take his place as its ruler. He did not descend to the oceans to command their tides and currents. Instead, he remained, his divine form racked with a grief so profound it became a destructive force in its own right. He did nothing but weep and howl, his beard growing long and unkempt, reaching down to his waist. His was not the quiet sorrow of a god in mourning, it was a cosmic lamentation. His incessant wailing was a plague upon the mortal world, causing the green mountains to wither and die, and the rivers and seas to dry up completely. An army of malevolent spirits, drawn to this chorus of divine despair, rose up to wreak havoc upon the land. His father, the great Izanagi, who had believed his work complete, saw the chaos unfolding. His patience, already worn thin by his ordeal in Yomi, finally snapped. He confronted his son, his voice no longer that of a proud father, but of an exasperated king. Why do you neglect the kingdom I have entrusted to you? Why do you bring ruin upon the world with these unending lamentations? Susanoo, his face streaked with tears, looked up at his father, and for the first time, gave voice to the source of his sorrow. His reason was not dissatisfaction with his own domain, but an obsessive, sorrowful longing for the mother he never knew. I weep because I do not wish to rule the seas. I wish to go to my mother's land, to Nanokatasakuni, the land of roots, the realm of shadow. To Izanagi this was the ultimate transgression. Susanoo was rejecting the world of life, the world his parents had fought to create, in favor of the polluted, decaying land of the dead. He longed for the very source of corruption that Izanagi had so desperately fled. This was not grief. It was a rejection of his very nature as a god of the living world. Izanagi's fury became absolute. Then you shall not dwell in this land. You are banished. Go where you will. Stripped of his home and his title, Susanoo accepted his fate. But before departing for his exile in the land of shadows, he made one final request. He wished to ascend to the high plane of heaven to bid farewell to his elder sister Amaterasu. A seemingly simple request, but the ascent of a storm god is never a simple affair. As he moved toward the heavens, the world itself recoiled. The earth groaned and the rivers churned. His every footstep was an earthquake, his every breath a raging gale. His chaotic energy sent shockwaves through the cosmos, a turbulent announcement of his approach. Amaterasu, from within her celestial palace, felt this tremendous disturbance. She, a goddess of unwavering order, knew that this was not the gentle approach of a brother coming to say goodbye. This was the arrival of a tempest. Suspecting his motives, believing he had come to usurp her kingdom, she prepared not for a reunion but for war. She abandoned her divine robes for the garb of a warrior. She bound her hair into martial knots, slung a quiver of 1,000 arrows onto her back, and another of 500 upon her front. She armed herself with a great bow and grasped her mighty sword, standing ready at the banks of the Amno Yasukawa, the tranquil river of heaven. She was not a sister waiting for her brother. She was a sovereign queen prepared to defend her realm against an invasion. When Susanoo finally arrived, he was met by this terrifying battle-ready figure. "For what purpose have you ascended to my domain?" Susanoo, perhaps startled by her martial welcome, protested his innocence. He explained his banishment at their father's hand and insisted his only desire was to say farewell before his final departure. But Amaterasu's suspicion was not so easily assuaged. His word was as volatile as the storms he commanded. "I cannot take your words as truth. How will you prove the purity of your heart?" To prove his sincerity, Susanoo proposed an Ukiya sacred trial by pledge. It was a ritual of divination, where truth would be revealed through the birth of new gods. They would each take a sacred item belonging to the other, chew it, and from the mist of their breath, new deities would be born. The gender and nature of these divine children would serve as the verdict. Amaterasu agreed. First, Amaterasu asked for her brother's 10-span sword. She broke the blade into 3 pieces, rinsed them in the true well of heaven, and crunched them in her mouth. From the mist she spat out. 3 graceful female deities were born. Then it was Susanoo's turn. He took the long string of 500 Magatama beads from his sister's hair, chewed them, and from his breath 5 strong and noble male deities were born. The trial was complete, but its interpretation would become the very seed of the conflict to come. Susanoo, filled with triumph, declared his victory. "Because the children born of my pledge are gentle maidens, it is clear I held no violent intent. And because your pledge produced noble male children, it proves the sincerity of my heart. I have won." By one interpretation he was correct. But Amaterasu, in a move of divine legalism, offered a different verdict. She declared that since the powerful male gods were born from her sacred jewels, they were her children, and the gentler female gods born from his sword were his. By this logic, she had produced the more significant offspring and was therefore the true victor. In that moment, Susanoo's world shifted. He had submitted to a trial to prove his innocence. He had, in his own eyes, succeeded. And yet, his sister had twisted the result, refusing to grant him the trust he sought. He felt both vindicated and rejected, both victorious and humiliated. A volatile storm of triumph and fury erupted in his heart. The seeds of discord, planted by his grief and watered by his sister's mistrust, had finally sprouted. The acquitted storm god, now feeling he had a license to act on his impulses, was about to unleash his full chaotic nature upon the pristine order of heaven. Vindicated by the ritual, yet scorned by its interpretation, Susanoo did not depart in peace. The trial that was meant to prove his sincerity had instead ignited his arrogance. He believed he had won a divine licensee, a celestial mandate to unleash the full, untamed fury of his nature upon the realm of perfect order. His farewell to his sister would not be a quiet departure, but a victory lap of pure, unrestrained chaos. What followed was not a single act of rage, but a calculated and escalating campaign of sacrilege, each transgression a direct and symbolic assault on everything his sister represented. His first target was the very source of life and sustenance in heaven, Amaterasu's sacred rice paddies. These were not mere fields. They were the heart of celestial agriculture, the foundation of ritual purity, tended with meticulous care by the sun goddess herself. In a fit of what the chronicles describe as ferocious valor, Susanoo descended upon them. He smashed down the carefully raised earthen dividers that separated the plots. He choked the life-giving irrigation channels with mud and stone, letting the sacred water run to waste and destroying the young shoots. It was an attack on the very concept of civilization, an act of undoing creation's careful work. When her attendants reported this outrage, Amaterasu chose the path of divine appeasement. She sought to maintain harmony, to rationalize the irrational. He must have broken the dividers because he thought the land could be put to better use. He must have filled the channels because he felt there was an excess of water. She saw his actions not as malice, but as misguided intent. Even when he continued his rampage, she excused it, saying he was merely acting out as if in a drunken revel. Her forgiveness was a shield, an attempt to absorb the chaos and preserve order. But her tolerance did not quell the storm. It only emboldened him. It was a signal to Susanoo that the boundaries of divine behavior could be pushed even further. His next transgression was more personal, more vile. The time for the nine-named Sai was approaching, the most sacred ritual of the divine calendar, when Amaterasu, as the high priestess of heaven, would taste the first fruits of the new harvest and offer them in communion to the gods. A great hall had been prepared for this solemn feast, a space of ultimate purity and thanksgiving. Knowing this, Susanoo waited until the hall was prepared. Then, under the cloak of secrecy, he crept inside. In an ultimate act of contempt and defilement, he defecated under the sacred throne where his sister, the Queen of Heaven, was to preside. When Amaterasu arrived to begin the ceremony and discovered the repulsive act, she was profoundly shaken. This was no longer a matter of misguided enthusiasm. It was a direct, personal, and disgusting insult. It polluted a sacred space and mocked her divine authority. Yet still, astonishingly, she sought to excuse him. She tried to see it as the crude and thoughtless prank of a wayward brother, a momentary lapse into base behavior. The well of her patience was deep, but the storm god was determined to find its bottom. The final act, the unforgivable transgression, would come when Amaterasu was at her most serene, engaged in her most sacred creative work. She was in her sacred weaving hall, a place of serene creation, surrounded by her celestial weaving maidens. Here they performed a holy task, weaving the garments for the gods. The steady hum of the looms, the rhythmic passing of the shuttle sit was the sound of order itself, the act of bringing beauty and structure from disparate threads. Suddenly, a violent crash shattered the peace. Susanoo, with his monstrous strength, had climbed onto the roof and torn a gaping hole in its sacred timbers. And through that hole he committed his most heinous crime. He hurled down the skinned, bloody carcass of a heavenly piebald Horsean animal that had been flayed backwards. An act of extreme sacrilege, and it fell directly into the midst of the terrified weavers. The grotesque, unholy intrusion sent the hall into a panic. The divine attendants shrieked in terror. In the chaos, one of Amaterasu's most beloved weaving maidens was so overcome with fear that, in her frantic attempt to flee, she struck her own body against the loom's shuttle with fatal force, and fell down dead. This was it. This was the breaking point. This was no longer mischief. This was no longer insult. This was defilement. This was desecration. And now this was death. Susanoo's storm had not just damaged property. It had breached the sacred walls of Amaterasu's own household and taken a life. The carefully maintained balance of the heavens was irrevocably shattered, stained by blood and sacrilege. The well of her patience had not just run dry. It had been poisoned. The forgiving sister vanished, consumed by a grief, terror, and rage that was absolute. The god of storms had finally pushed the sun too far. And in her boundless despair, the great august divinity who shines in heaven made a choice that would unmake the world. She would extinguish the sun. She would let the darkness win. There was no divine wrath. No outburst of fiery retribution. The violence inflicted by Susanoo was so absolute, so personal it had transcended anger. The death of her attendant in the heart of her sacred domain was a wound so deep it could not be healed by vengeance. The spirit of the sun goddess, the very embodiment of life and order, had been broken. In that moment of unendurable grief and terror, Amaterasu came to a cataclysmic decision. If the heavens could be a place of such violation, then the heavens were not worthy of her light. If this was the result of her cosmic duty, she would abdicate. She did not speak. She did not issue a decree. She simply walked. Her every step was an act of renunciation. She sought out a place of refuge, a deep and primeval cavern in the rock of heaven known as the Amano-Iwaroth Heavenly Rock Cave. It was a place of darkness, of sanctuary, of utter isolation. It was to be her tomb, and the tomb of the light of the world. With the finality that would echo through all eternity, she stepped across the threshold, surrendering herself to the gloom. And from within the cave, with a strength born of ultimate despair, she took hold of a colossal boulder, a great stone of heaven, and rolled it into place, sealing the entrance completely. The light of heaven and earth was extinguished. In that instant, a darkness unlike any night fell upon the universe. It was not the gentle dark of Tsukuyami's moonlit sky. It was a primordial blackness, an absolute and suffocating void. The high plane of heaven Takamagara was plunged into an immediate and perpetual twilight, its divine radiance snuffed out. The consequences on earth were immediate and catastrophic. With the life-giving warmth of the sun gone, an unnatural winter fell upon the land. The green crops in the fields blackened and withered. A cold, hard frost settled over the soil. The rhythm of life ceased. But the absence of light brought a far greater terror than cold and famine. Darkness is the domain of evil. The myriad malevolent kami, the spirits of misfortune, chaos, and dread, were no longer held in check by the purifying light of the sun. They swarmed out from their shadowy corners, running rampant across the land and heavens. The world, once a place of growing life, was now a cacophony of terror. The wails of the wicked gods echoed in the unending night, and calamities plagued what was left of creation. The very fabric of existence was beginning to unravel. The 800 myriad deities of the heavens were in a panic. They gathered in the gloom, their divine authority rendered meaningless. They pleaded, they shouted, they reasoned, they begged Amaterasu to return. They cried out her name until their voices were hoarse. But from within the heavenly rock cave came only a profound and terrifying silence. Order had collapsed. The world was dying. And all because the sun itself had chosen to hide its face in grief. The gods knew they could not force the cave open. To do so would be to violate the will of their queen and risk further catastrophe. Force had failed. Pleading had failed. The very existence of creation now hung by a thread, dependent on convincing a heartbroken goddess to willingly emerge from her sorrow. They needed a plan. And so in their desperation they turned to the wisest among them, Omoiken no Kami, the god of wisdom and counsel, a deity whose thoughts were as vast as the heavens themselves. Upon his divine ingenuity, the fate of all worlds now rested. A plan had to be forged, not of power but of cunning. A strategy not to break down the door, but to coax the sun itself to come outside. The world was dying in the dark. Pleas had proven useless against the stone door of the heavenly rock cave. Force was unthinkable. In this moment of ultimate crisis, the collective hope of the 800 myriad gods rested on the shoulders of one deity, Omoiken, the god of wisdom. His plan, when it was conceived, was not one of brute force or somber negotiation. It was a masterpiece of celestial psychology, a divine stratagem born of a profound understanding of the goddess he sought to coax from the shadows. They would not break down the door. They would make Amaterasu want to open it herself. They would appeal not to her duty, but to her curiosity and her pride. Under Omoiken's direction, a grand and bizarre stage was set before the mouth of the cave. First, they gathered the Tokoyo no Naganakidori, the long-crowing roosters of the eternal land, whose calls are the very heralds of the dawn. They were placed before the cave to crow incessantly, creating the illusion of a new day that refused to arrive. Next, they journeyed to the celestial Mount Kagu and uprooted a great and sacred sakiki tree, carrying it back to be planted before the cave entrance. This tree would become their altar. From its highest branches, they hung a magnificent string of 500 Yasakani no Magatama jewels, their gentle curved forms catching what little ambient light remained. From the middle branches, they hung the masterwork of the divine smiths, the Yada no Kagami, the 8-span mirror. It was a flawless, holy object, polished to such a perfect sheen it could capture a soul. And on the lower branches they draped offerings of fine white and blue cloth, symbols of purity and devotion. The physical stage was set. Every element was in place. Now the performance could begin. The lead role in this divine comedy fell to a goddess perfectly suited for the task, Amaterasu no Mikoto, the kami of the dawn, of mirth, and of heavenly revelry. She strode to the center of the gathering, overturned a large wooden tub to create a makeshift drum, and began her dance. Adorning herself with a crown of heavenly vines and a sash of moss, she began to stamp her feet, the hollow sound echoing strangely in the dead air. Her dance grew more fervent, more frenzied, until she seemed to fall into a state of divine possession. The rhythm became wild, untamed, and utterly infectious. Then, in a final act of outrageous and sacred abandon, she began to tear off her clothes. She bared her breasts and pulled her skirt down low, dancing with the wild primordial joy. It was a performance at once lewd, comical, and utterly shocking. The effect on the 800 myriad gods was instantaneous and overwhelming. A single chuckle broke the tension, then another, and then the entire plane of high heaven erupted in a thunderous, earth-shaking wave of pure, unadulterated joy. The sound of their collective laughter was so immense, so powerful, that the very pillars of heaven seemed to shake with it. Inside her tomb of stone and sorrow, Amaterasu heard the impossible sound. Laughter. How could there be laughter? She had withdrawn her light. The world should be plunged into chaos and weeping. How could the gods be celebrating? What could possibly bring them such joy in a world devoid of a sun? Her divine curiosity, the one emotion more powerful than her grief, began to stir. She crept to the entrance and pushed the great stone aside, just a crack, to peer out into the gloom. I have hidden myself away, and the high plain of heaven and the central land of the reed plains are in darkness. For what reason does Aamnoism dance? And for what reason do the 800 myriad gods laugh? Aamnoism, without missing a beat, called back the perfectly prepared lie. We rejoice and we are glad, she cried, because there is a goddess here more illustrious and more radiant than you, august one. As she spoke these words, the great mirror was thrust before the crack in the door. Amaterasu peered out, expecting to see this rival deity, and she saw light, a being of overwhelming power, of blinding beautiful radiance, a goddess of unimaginable splendor. She was captivated, stunned by the beauty and power of the light she saw. Believing it to be the new goddess, she instinctively leaned further out of the cave, trying to get a better look at this magnificent being who was, of course, herself. It was the moment they had been waiting for. Hiding beside the entrance was the god of immense strength, Aamnotajakureo. In that instant of distraction he shot out his hand, seized the sun goddess firmly, and with all his might, pulled her the rest of the way out of the cave. Simultaneously, another god rushed forward and immediately stretched a Shimenawa sacred rope of rice straw across the cave's entrance, creating a holy boundary and sealing it shut. You may not retreat beyond this point, he declared. A divine barrier was erected between the sun and her sanctuary of darkness. She could never hide herself away again. And with her full emergence, light, life and warmth flooded back into the universe. The oppressive darkness was banished in a brilliant wave. The malevolent spirits shrieked and fled back to their shadowy corners. The withered crops on earth turned green once more. The world was saved. Laughter and cunning had succeeded where solemn pleas had failed. The divine comedy had brought back the dawn. But amidst the celebration, a final somber question remained. The light had returned, but the god who had caused its departure was still at large. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was yet to come. The light had returned. The world was saved. But the joyous roar of the gods gradually subsided, replaced by a profound and sobering silence. The restoration of order demanded more than simply bringing back the sun. Order required justice. The architect of the world's near demise, the source of the sacrilege and death that had wounded the heavens, had to be held to account. All eyes of the celestial tribunal, now bathed in the light he had almost extinguished, turned to the matter of Susanoo no Mikoto. His crimes were recounted before the divine council. They were not the mere pranks of a wayward brother, but unforgivable transgressions against the divine order. He had destroyed the sacred fields, the source of life. He had polluted the great hall with filth, an act of supreme contempt. He had committed the ultimate sacrilege in the weaving hall, an act of horrific violence that led directly to the death of a celestial attendant. And through his terror, he had driven the sun goddess herself from the sky, bringing all of creation to the brink of eternal night. There could be no forgiveness for such a cascade of cosmic treason. The judgment of the 800 myriad gods was unanimous and severe. The punishment was not swift annihilation, but a systematic and humiliating stripping of everything that defined him as a god. First, he was made to atone for the physical and spiritual damage he had caused. A punitive offering was levied against him, a restitution so vast it was said to consist of 1,000 tables laden with gifts. It was a fine design to strip him of his wealth and status, a material apology for his reign of terror. But the punishment had to go deeper than material cost. It had to be a purification, a ritual of humiliation to cleanse the heavens of his stain. They forcibly cut his beard, the very symbol of his divine manhood and authority, shorning it from his face. Then, in a final act of debasement, his fingernails and toenails were pulled out, a painful and debasing ritual meant to purge his corruption through suffering. He was systematically unmade, reduced from a fearsome god to a shamed and mutilated outcast. Finally, with his wealth confiscated and his body shamed, the ultimate sentence was passed. He was formally and permanently banished from Takamagara. This was no temporary reprieve, no journey with the promise of return. It was an irrevocable decree of expulsion. He was declared a pariah, unfit to dwell in the celestial realm. The god of storms was cast out. His ascent to heaven had shaken the firmament with his power and rage. His descent was one of solitary shame. He plummeted from the floating bridge of heaven, a disgraced exile falling through the sky, leaving the realm of light and order behind him forever. He landed, not in the sea which was his to command, nor in the land of shadows he had longed for, but in the mortal world, the central land of reed plains. He found himself in the earthly province of Izumo, near the headwaters of the river Hai. His celestial life was over. His divine rampage had been answered with exile. He had been a prince of heaven, a god of immense power, a volatile child and a cosmic vandal. Now, he was nothing but an outcast in a foreign land. But here in the mortal soil, far from the polished halls of heaven and the grieving ghost of his mother, a new journey was about to begin. It would be here, in the world of men and monsters, that the violent, petulant god would finally have the chance to become something more. A hero. Cast down from the heavens, Susanoo, the god of storms, found himself a stranger in a strange land. The pristine order of Takamagara was a distant memory, and the mortal world, the central land of reed plains, was now his home and his prison. As he wandered along the headwaters of the high river, his divine purpose lost, he came across a sound that was all too familiar to him, the sound of weeping. An old man and an old woman sat sobbing, with a lovely young maiden between them. Susanoo, whose own grief had once threatened to unmake the world, was moved by the sight. He approached them, his divine presence still palpable despite his exile. "Who are you, and why do you grieve so deeply?" The old man looked up, his eyes weary with years of sorrow. He introduced himself as Ashinazuchi, an earthly deity, and his wife as Tenazuchi. The maiden was their last remaining daughter, Kushinadaheim. "We once had 8 daughters, great lord. But for 7 years a beast has come from the mountains. Each year it has claimed one of them, and now the time for its return is near. Soon we will have to give up our last child." Susanoo's interest was piqued. This was not the chaotic tantrum of a god, but a tangible monstrous threat. "What manner of creature is this?" he asked. The old man's description painted a picture of unimaginable horror. "It is the Yamata no Orochi, the 8-forked serpent. It has a single body, but from it grow 8 heads and 8 tails. Its eyes glow like winter cherries, and its back is covered with moss, fir and cypress trees. Its belly is perpetually inflamed and smeared with blood. Its colossal body is so vast that it covers 8 valleys and 8 hills. It is the great scourge of this land." As Susanoo listened, something shifted within him. The weeping of this family, the terror of this monster, it was a problem he could understand. It was a clear injustice, a straightforward evil. Here was a storm he could fight, a chaos he could conquer. Here was a chance for a new purpose. He looked at the beautiful Kushinadaheim, then back to her desperate parents. He made them a proposal, his voice regaining some of its old, divine authority. "If this is your daughter, then you shall give her to me. Present her to be my wife, and I will slay this serpent for you." Desperate in seeing the divine power radiating from the exile, they agreed without hesitation. Susanoo's first act was to protect his future bride. He could not risk her safety in the coming battle. Using the divine arts he still possessed, he performed an act of transformative magic. He changed the maiden into a fine-toothed comb and placed her safely in his hair. With her protected, he turned his mind to the battle. He would not meet this monster with pure, chaotic force as he might have in his youth. His exile had taught him something. He would meet it with cunning. He instructed the parents to brew 8 vats of the most potent, 8 times refined sake. Then he had them build a great fence, and in that fence, he had them cut 8 gates. Behind each gate, he placed one of the vats of liquor. Then with his trap laid he waited. Soon the air grew heavy, and the ground began to tremble. The monstrous Yamata no Orochi appeared. Its 8 heads swaying on long necks, its 8 tails thrashing behind it, its colossal body a moving landscape of dread. Drawn by the powerful, intoxicating aroma of the refined sake, the beast was enticed. It lowered each of its 8 heads through one of the gates and began to drink greedily from the vats. It drained every last drop. The potent alcohol quickly took its effect. The monster's movements became sluggish, its 8 heads swayed drunkenly, and at last, the great serpent collapsed into a deep, intoxicated slumber, utterly helpless. This was the moment Susanoo had been waiting for. Drawing the great Tatsuka no Tsurugi, the 10-span sword he had once offered in the trial against his sister, he fell upon the sleeping beast. The battle was a feat of titanic butchery. He lunged and hacked, severing each of the serpent's 8 heads one by one. He sliced through its thick hide, cutting off its 8 tails. The high river, once clear, ran crimson with the monster's blood. At last the terrible Yamata no Orochi lay dead, a mountain of slain flesh. But as Susanoo was cutting the great central tail, his sword struck something unyielding within its flesh. The clash of steel on an unknown object rang out. Puzzled, he used the point of his blade to slice the tail open. And there, nestled within the body of the great serpent, he found a treasure beyond imagining. It was a magnificent sword, a single perfect blade that seemed to hum with a divine aura. Its craftsmanship unlike anything on earth or in heaven. He took it and held it aloft. He named it Amaterasu no Susanoo, Sword of the Gathering Clouds of Heaven. The exile had become a savior. The vandal had become a hero. In a single valorous act, he had freed a land from its terror, won himself a wife, and uncovered one of the most powerful sacred treasures in existence. He had channeled his storm into a righteous cause, and in doing so, had taken the first true step on the long road back to grace. The blood of the serpent had washed the land clean, but it had not yet washed clean the sins of the god who slew it. The hero's work was not yet done. Standing amidst the carnage of his victory, Susanoo looked upon the sword he had found. It was more than a weapon, it was a miracle. It felt ancient, powerful, and pure. He, a god of chaos and exile, knew instinctively that this was a holy relic, a treasure worthy not of an earthly hero, but of the highest heavens. In that moment the path to true redemption became clear. His heroism in the mortal realm was not the end of his journey, but the means to an end. To truly heal the cosmic rift he had created, he had to do more than simply cease his rampage. He had to make a gesture of ultimate contrition, an offering that would prove once and for all that the storm had truly passed. He would not keep the sword as a trophy of his own valor. He would present it to the one he had wronged the most. It would be his message, his treaty, his final unspoken apology. And so the sword of the gathering clouds of heaven was sent to the high plane of heaven and presented to Amaterasu. She, the sun goddess who had been driven into hiding by his violence, now looked upon this gift born from that same violence, but transformed through heroism. She accepted it. This was the act that truly healed the breach between them. It was a wordless acknowledgement of her supremacy and a humble plea for peace. In the sword's cold steel, she saw not the memory of his transgression, but the proof of his repentance. The long and bitter rivalry between the sun and the storm was finally over. Susanoo, his atonement complete, would go on to become a great progenitor god in the land of Izumo, his chaotic nature now a protective ancestral force. And the sword he offered became a cornerstone of a new divine legacy. This sword, later renamed Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, after a future legend, would not stand alone. It was destined to join 2 other sacred artifacts from their great conflict to form a trinity of holy treasures. These were the Sanshu no Jinja, 3 sacred treasures of Japan. First, there is the Yada no Kagami, the 8-span mirror. The very tool of wisdom and divine trickery that had been used to lure Amaterasu from her cave, forcing her to confront her own light. It represents wisdom, the virtue of truth, honesty, and self-reflection. Second, there is the Yasakani no Magatama, the magnificent string of jewels that hung upon the sacred tree, an offering from the gods to appease their furious queen, the object from which Susanoo himself had produced noble gods during their trial. It represents benevolence, the virtue of compassion, generosity, and the will to yield for the greater good. And third, there is the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the sword born from the belly of chaos, discovered by a hero, and offered as an act of peace. It represents valor, the virtue of courage, strength, and the power to overcome evil. Wisdom, benevolence, and valor. Together, these 3 treasures are not mere mythological objects. They are the living symbols of the imperial throne of Japan, passed down through generations of emperors as proof of their divine lineage. They are the physical embodiment of this entire saga, a legacy born from conflict. They are a permanent, sacred reminder that the ideal ruler must possess the wisdom of the gods, the benevolence of the forgiving sun, and the valor of a redeemed storm. The rivalry that nearly ended the world had, in its resolution, created the very foundation of its future. The story of Amaterasu and Susanoo is more than a creation myth. It is more than a simple tale of good triumphing over evil. It is a profound primordial drama woven into the very fabric of the cosmos, a grand exploration of the fundamental dualities that govern all of existence. It is the story of order versus chaos, light versus the storm, the serene harmony of civilization versus the untamed wilderness of nature. Amaterasu is the embodiment of serene, life-giving order. She is the predictable rising of the sun, the warmth that nurtures the crops, the light of reason and ritual that make civilization possible. Susanoo, in his turn, is the untamed, unpredictable force of nature. He is the destructive rage of a typhoon, the raw emotion of grief, but also the fierce, indomitable power that can vanquish monsters and protect the weak. Yet, their saga teaches us that these forces are not so clearly defined. It shows that even the purest light can falter. Amaterasu's retreat into the heavenly rock cave, while born of justified grief, was itself a catastrophic dereliction of her divine duty, an act of cosmic abandonment that nearly destroyed everything. And Susanoo's chaotic rampage was not born of pure malice, but from a recognizable, almost human feeling of grief, rejection, and perceived injustice. The story reminds us that absolute order, when faced with trauma, can become brittle and self-destructive, and that even from the heart of chaos, great heroism and lasting redemption can emerge. The final resolution of their conflict is not the victory of one sibling over the other. It is not the annihilation of chaos by order. It is a final, hard-won balance. It is a synthesis. Chaos is not destroyed. It is harnessed. The storm god becomes a protector. The violent brother becomes the ancestor of earthly kings. The conflict itself gives birth to the very symbols of a unified, virtuous rule, the imperial regalia that embody the wisdom to see truth, the benevolence to forgive, and the valor to defend. It is a timeless epic tale that tells us that a world without the storm's passion, raw power, and capacity for change is just as incomplete and barren as a world without the sun's steady light and order. Both are necessary for the whole. It is a story woven into the very soul of a nation, a foundational myth that still resonates today, reminding us that even in the darkest night, a divine comedy can bring back the dawn, and that the most destructive storms can sometimes leave behind the greatest and most sacred of treasures. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Japanese mythology. The sagas of the Shinto gods are deep and complex, offering a timeless look into the forces that shape our world and ourselves. If you wish to continue exploring the forgotten histories and epic tales from the world's great mythologies, Be sure to subscribe to the Eldritch Codex and ring the bell for notifications so you never miss a chapter. We have many more stories to share from the annals of lore. Until next time, continue to seek the wisdom of the ancients.